My name is Izza. I'm a PhD candidate at OISI. Today, I'm going to be presenting early results from one component of my doctoral research. And I apologize in advance. I have a cold, so I'm probably going to be sniffling my way through this. So apologies. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly whiz through the context and the study, just point out like the important things. So my study broadly is focused on teachers' reading instruction practices in the Punjab province of Pakistan in the early grades. Um, Punjab is the most populous province of the country. It's predominantly ethnically Punjabi. The national languages, the national language of the country is Urdu, while the official language is English. Um, so the study itself looks at how teachers' instructional practices are shaped by these three groups of factors that you see here: their biography, their beliefs and perspectives, and the education ecosystem within which they work. And all of this is within a specific sociocultural, historical, and religious context. So today I'm going to be focusing on one aspect of this ecosystem, the single national curriculum, the SNC, and the language portion of this specifically, and looking at how teachers implement it and negotiate it in light of these other factors. So this was a qualitative multi-case study. I had two samples of teachers, a primary sample of 8, secondary sample of 11, and then I interviewed 3 people who were directly involved in the development of this curriculum. So the SNC was actually a politically motivated and a very contentious curriculum reform. It caused immense backlash from a number of stakeholders. A very quick timeline. In 2018, Prime Minister Imran Khan was elected into power. The curriculum reform was actually a part of their election manifesto. So in 2019, they announced that they were going to, make good on this promise. In August 2021, the first phase was implemented. In April 2022, Imran Khan was ousted from power. And then in a few months, the new government renamed the curriculum. So now it's known as the National Curriculum of Pakistan. They made a few cosmetic changes, but for the most part, it is the same curriculum and is still being used. So I'm going to be looking at the English portion of the SNC today, although my study looks at both Urdu and English. And just some key aspects of the curriculum I want to highlight are, first, the addition of more interactive, collaborative pedagogical strategies. It advocated for more activity-based learning than the previous curriculum did. Second, it continued the rhetorical shift towards more mother tongue-based instruction. So it cited long-standing research in support of this. And here you see the language goals and the learning objectives as stated in the document itself. So the language goal for the primary grades was to build a strong conceptual and linguistic foundation in the local language. And the objectives were first to teach in a language that will add to this conceptual foundation and strengthen students' ethnic identity. And they're presumably talking about the local language here. And then second, also to teach languages that will enable participation nationally and internationally. And presumably they're talking about Urdu and English here. So they're covering all the languages. And again, on paper, they leave the option to choose the language of the textbooks to the provinces because education is a provincial domain, with some guidelines on how to select the language. Third, they explicitly say that English is now to be taught as a language rather than as a subject. And the goal is for students to achieve competence in the language. So what they did was they shifted around the order of the language skills. So now listening and speaking came before reading and writing. And in the previous curriculum, there was much more emphasis on the reading and writing aspect of it. And I just want to make a quick note here that the actual education policy states that English is to be taught as a second language. So we'll come back to this later on. So fourth, this curriculum was also a shift towards a more phonics-based instructional approach. So the curriculum itself is a pretty hefty document. It's like some 500 pages with a series of progressive student learning outcomes for each grade level that build on each other. But just to give you a flavor, these are some of the student learning outcomes from each grade level at the primary grades. So at the ECE level, for instance, they start with a focus on letter recognition and phonemic awareness. And then for grades 1 to 3, the overarching goal is for students to learn to use phonological awareness to successfully decode and read unfamiliar words. And the emphasis is on using phonics as the main method of tackling unfamiliar words. So this was a very, very brief snapshot of what the SNC for English looks like. Now let's come to how it plays out in the classroom. So once again, the SNC lays out in a very detailed fashion how students are to progress from letter recognition all the way through to reading with fluency and comprehension. The textbooks for Punjab are actually very closely aligned with the student learning outcomes as laid out in the SNC. The chapters are activity-based, they're structured in a way that they give the teacher pretty much a ready-made lesson. And these textbooks were actually developed by the same people who were involved in the curriculum development itself, so that causes the good alignment between them. But even despite this, what I would call an almost teacher-proof curriculum, actual reading instruction in the classroom still looks very different from how it's laid out in the SNC. In fact, teachers negotiate the SNC in line with, their work environment, the beliefs, the perspectives, the learning theories they bring to the classroom, as well as their own professional and personal educational experiences. So right off the bat, teachers report that the activity-based interactive learning is most of the time simply not physically possible. They have too many students, they don't have enough time, and they have limited access to teaching aids, manipulatives, and even space to move around the furniture in the classroom to facilitate that kind of group work and activities. And if they start doing individualized work, they will never be able to complete the syllabus. So they have a very real pressure in the government sector to cover syllabus at the pace that's laid out for them. And this is enforced during monthly monitoring visits. Second, there's an expectation on teachers that there will be daily written work completed by the students for each subject and marked by the teacher. And this comes from parents, but also sometimes from administration, and it reflects a cultural emphasis on written work. Real work is written work. That's the conception of work. So reading or activities isn't really considered work. So because now the teacher is under all this pressure to A, complete the lesson, B, do the work, mark all the notebooks, she really has no time to do any activities in the class. Teachers' beliefs, they play a big role in how they implement and negotiate the curriculum. And again, this is well recorded in research. So with regard to mother tongue-based education in Punjab, teachers hold deep-seated beliefs. They're actually very widespread in that society as a whole about the hierarchy of languages in this context. So like many post-colonial contexts, English in Pakistan and especially Punjab sits at the top of the hierarchy, followed by Urdu and then Punjabi at the bottom. And there are historical and socioeconomic reasons for this. But Punjabi is widely perceived as the language of the uneducated. Now, the problem that arises is that for the student demographic that attends these government schools and the low-cost private schools, Punjabi is usually this language spoken at home, and most of them aren't even able to speak Urdu very well. So what happens in the classroom is that far from, quote, strengthening students' identities that the SNC would like to do, they are not only not taught in their own language, but rather the teachers actually forbid them from speaking their language in school altogether. This is compounded by another issue, which is conflicting perspectives about what would be considered the mother tongue for these children. So on the one hand, they are ethnically Punjabi, their parents speak Punjabi at home, but in many cases, because of the connection of Urdu with upward social mobility and the attitudes about Punjabi, many of these parents actually make a conscious effort to speak Urdu with their children, even while all the adults at home are speaking Punjabi amongst themselves. But regardless of whether or not Punjabi is the mother tongue, there's consensus that Punjabi should not be used in any capacity in the school because that defeats the perceived purpose of education in the first place. Teachers also hold strong beliefs about additive approaches to multilingualism. So, for instance, there's a very strong and uniformly held belief that English should start from the get-go, from the very beginning, even if the child has no exposure to English outside the school at all or no background knowledge in English, which is usually the case. Teachers also believe that reading is actually the ability to correctly decode a text. Whether or not you understand the text, comprehension, that is a different thing, although it is related. So again, in the classroom, we see an emphasis on correct decoding, correctly identifying a word, and correctly using it at the expense of developing comprehension. The emphasis on teaching English as a language and developing students' listening and speaking skills is simply not happening. Why? Because teachers can't speak English. English language teachers in these kind of school contexts, they tend to lack the fluency and competency in the language, and this is again well supported by existing research. Second, the students don't understand English at all. So teachers say that even if we were to speak in English, they simply would have to translate everything into Urdu, word for word. So they choose to speak in Urdu. And the only English that is actually spoken in the English language classroom is either a direct reading of the text, which is again translated word for word, or common classroom phrases like, Miss, may I be excused, which children then memorize. Similarly, there is no phonics based instruction happening in the class, at least as laid out in the curriculum. Now, the interesting thing is that many of the teachers say that phonics is the best way to learn to read. None of them themselves learned to read using phonics. There was no phonics training in the B.Ed and the M who completed these. The government teachers received no training on phonics, although some of the private teachers in my sample did receive some training, but they have all heard of phonics. And almost all the teachers describe some version of a sounds-based technique as the best way to teach. So the classroom observations revealed that teachers were using a sort of a hybrid method, which resembled the method that was historically used for teaching English in Pakistan, and which the teachers also described their own teachers using with them. And this is a grammar translation method, but now with some elements of phonics thrown in. And this seems to come first from their own experiences as students, from their, apprenticeship of observation. The teachers all hold their own teachers in high esteem. This is in part a cultural norm. And many of the teachers directly try to emulate their teachers, and they explicitly say so. And we know from research that this plays a significant role in shaping teacher practices. So the teachers in my sample overwhelmingly said that they believe that children learn through repeated exposure to something. They themselves learn to read like this. Repetition, repeated practice, this is what they call drill. And we see a direct translation of this into practice. Every single teacher employs this as a teaching method. They do drills of letters, of words, even of entire paragraphs. And the idea is that the more the child receives exposure to something, the easier it will be for her to learn it. So the hybrid method that emerges in the classroom does so because the teachers are attempting to teach using phonics with the limited knowledge they have of it, of what it entails and how it would be taught. And they combine this with the drill method that they know very well. So what it looks like in the classroom is, whereas before students would be taught to memorize A, apple, B, ball, C, cat, all the way down to Z, now they're memorizing A, apple, B, ball, C, cat. The difference is that now they're highlighting the initial phoneme. Sometimes they do break the word down into all the component phonemes, but there's no systematic and sequential teaching of phonics happening in the classroom. So to conclude, reading instruction appears to be the result of the interplay of teachers' beliefs, their experiences, and their work environment, and it does not seem to align very well with how it's laid out in the SNC. And if you look at the history of education reform in Pakistan, this is hardly surprising. The SNC is simply the latest in a long line of misguided and somewhat confused language policies, which are out of touch with ground reality, and they're more aspirational in nature. And just to wrap up with an example, in the case of the SNC development, there was confusion around whether they were going to teach English as a second language or English as a foreign language. And this quote sums it up really nicely. I apologize for the length of it, but this is from an individual who played a key role in the development of both the curriculum and the textbooks. And the minister they're referring to is actually the Federal Minister of Education. So I will just end with reiterating the need to understand that teachers are active agents with their own beliefs, their experiences, the ground realities that they have to work with. And these all need to be taken into account into the design of policies and curricula. And second, the policies themselves need to have a clear focus and clear aims. And I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you.